All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're gonna do a deep dive into something pretty intense, honestly. Immigration policy in President Trump's second term.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of sources here, and the picture they paint is, well, it's, it's complicated to say the least. Looks like some major changes could be on the way for immigrant families, the economy, maybe even our legal system.
You know what really jumps out at me is how much of this is about just like the sheer scale of immigration in the US. Like, did you know there are over 47 million immigrants living here right now?
Oh, wow.
And 1 in 4 kids in the country has at least one parent who's an immigrant.
Honestly, I had no idea the numbers were that high. I guess that shows how much immigration is a part of, like every single aspect of American life. And with all these big policy changes potentially happening, well, things that get
Interesting.
interesting is one word for it, yeah.
It's more than just interesting for a lot of people. This is life-changing stuff. And one of the biggest question marks is what's going to happen to DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program.
Right.
This program protects undocumented immigrants who were brought here as kids from being deported. And honestly, it's been in legal limbo for years now.
Yeah, didn't Trump try to end it during his first term?
He did.
But then the Supreme Court blocked it, right?
Exactly. And then the Biden administration, they tried to make it stronger with some new regulations, but a Texas district court ruling threw a wrench in those plans.
So, I mean, what does that even mean for DACA recipients right now?
It puts them in a really tough spot. There are over 500,000 people who rely on DACA, and many of them, they've built their entire lives here. They have U.S.-born children, they contribute to our economy, and if the program's found unlawful, they could get deported.
That's terrifying for those families. And then there's the whole thing with the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, being dragged into this as well.
That's a crucial point. There was this recent expansion of health care coverage for DACA recipients under the ACA, but even that's facing legal challenges right now. As it stands, DACA recipients in 19 states aren't eligible to enroll in ACA marketplace coverage. So, they're getting hit from both sides. Their legal status is up in the air, and now their access to health care is too.
It's like they're being targeted from all these different directions. And then there's that public charge thing. One of our sources mentioned that Trump might bring back those changes to the policy. Didn't the Biden administration get rid of those?
They did roll back those changes, but the thing is, policies, especially immigration policies, they have this ripple effect,
Yeah.
fear and uncertainty. That can stick around long after the policies themselves are gone.
So what do you mean by that?
Even if a policy is reversed, the fear it caused, it often stays within those communities. The public charge rule is a good example. Basically, it made it harder for immigrants to get permanent residency if they used, certain public benefits, food stamps, Medicaid, things like that. And even though those changes were reversed, a Kaiser Family Foundation survey found that a lot of immigrants are still afraid to use those benefits because they think it might mess up their chances of staying in the country.
So basically the damage is already done, even though the policy is technically gone. It makes you think, maybe that fear was kind of intentional, like a way to discourage immigrants from using the services they're actually entitled to.
That's a sharp observation. And it says a lot about the whole climate surrounding immigration policy. The rhetoric, the perception, it often overshadows what's actually happening legally.
So, okay, we've got DACA hanging by a thread and all this anxiety left over from the public charge rule. It seems like things are set up for some pretty big shifts when it comes to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
What else is on the table for Trump's second term?
One of the most important issues, and probably the most controversial part of his whole platform on immigration is, it's his position on mass deportations. He's made it pretty clear that he plans to ramp up deportations big time, potentially targeting millions of undocumented immigrants.
Okay, so that's where things get really complicated. Even if we just ignore the ethical side of it, the human cost. Wouldn't mass deportations on that scale have massive economic consequences?
100%. And our sources really go into detail on this. Immigrants, documented or not, they're vital to the U.S. economy. They make up a huge chunk of the workforce in industries like agriculture, construction, healthcare. Taking millions of workers out of the economy would almost certainly lead to labor shortages, which could then push up costs for everyone, businesses and consumers alike.
I see your point, but I know some people say immigrants take jobs away from American citizens and drive down wages. How do you respond to that?
It's a common argument, but the research just doesn't really back it up. Economists who've looked into this generally agree that immigration actually has a positive impact on the economy overall. Immigrants create jobs, they bring new ideas, and they help boost productivity.
So from a purely economic standpoint, mass deportations are, oh, they're a pretty big risk. But then you've got the human side of it too, right?
Exactly. We're talking about families being torn apart, lives disrupted, communities destabilized. And our sources talk about the potential for psychological trauma, especially for kids who see their parents detained or deported.
It's hard to even think about. And then there's the ripple effects on whole communities, the fear, the mistrust.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not just undocumented immigrants who would be affected. Our sources highlight how this increased enforcement, the threat of deportation, it creates this chilling effect that reaches all immigrant communities, even those who are here legally. People get scared to talk to authorities, to report crimes, even to get medical help because they're afraid of being targeted.
So it creates this feeling of anxiety and insecurity that just like hangs over everyone. And then there's that whole thing about ending birthright citizenship. Didn't Trump bring that up? But isn't that like in the Constitution?
It is, which is what makes it so controversial. The 14th Amendment, it guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil, no matter their parents' immigration status. Trump's argument is that he can change that with an executive order, specifically targeting children of undocumented immigrants.
Wait, hold on. So he's saying he can change the Constitution by just like signing a piece of paper? How is that even possible?
Well, it's not that simple. His whole argument relies on a very narrow interpretation of the 14th Amendment, and even legal experts don't agree on whether it would hold up in court. If he did issue an executive order like that, it would definitely face immediate legal challenges and could very well end up in front of the Supreme Court.
Okay, so now we're not just talking about immigration policy. We're talking about a potential constitutional crisis.
You got it. This could have huge implications, not just for immigrants, but for the very foundation of American law and the balance of power between the different branches of government.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. We've talked about DACA, the public charge rule, mass deportations, and now potentially changing birthright citizenship. And it sounds like there's even more to come.
Oh yeah, we're just scratching the surface here. And while those legal battles over birthright citizenship could drag on for years, there are other policies that could have a much quicker impact, like bringing back the Remain in Mexico policy.
Right, I remember that from like Trump's first term. It basically forced people seeking asylum to stay in Mexico while their cases were being heard in U.S. courts, right?
Exactly. And the conditions for those asylum seekers were, well, they were pretty awful. Overcrowding, not enough food or water, and they were really vulnerable to crime and exploitation. The Biden administration shut it down because of humanitarian concerns, but Trump says he's going to bring it back.
That just sounds like a step backwards, especially considering how vulnerable these people are. They're running from violence and persecution.
Yeah.
And then they end up facing even more hardship and uncertainty.
It's something that a lot of our sources bring up. They talk about the psychological toll it takes on these asylum seekers. They have to live in this constant state of fear and anxiety, not knowing what's going to happen to them.
That's got to be so tough. And it's not just Remain in Mexico either. The sources also mentioned that Trump wants to make detention facilities much bigger and use expedited removal more often, which is basically a fast track for deportations, right?
Yeah, that's right. And both of those things raise some serious red flags. Expanding detention facilities means more people being held in places that are already often overcrowded and just not adequate. They have limited access to lawyers and healthcare. And with expedited removal, there's a higher risk of people being deported without a fair chance to make their case. They could be separated from their families and sent back to really dangerous situations.
That sounds like it could lead to some serious human rights violations. And on top of all that, some of the sources mention that Trump wants to get the military involved in immigration enforcement, even suggesting that he might use the Insurrection Act at the border.
That's a pretty scary thought. The Insurrection Act basically lets the president send active duty military troops to do domestic law enforcement. It's something that almost never happens, and it raises some big concerns about the border becoming militarized. Plus, there's the question of whether it's even legal to use the military like that. The Posse Comitatus Act usually prevents the military from getting involved in domestic law enforcement.
So it seems like he's trying to find ways around the law to get what he wants. And our sources suggest that it's not just about enforcement. Trump has also talked about cutting funding to sanctuary cities, which are basically places that don't fully cooperate with federal immigration enforcement.
That's another part of his plan. He claims that these sanctuary cities are protecting criminals and going against federal law. But critics say that taking away their funding would just end up hurting immigrant communities more and making them less safe.
It feels like everything he's proposing is meant to make things harder for immigrants, whether they're here legally or not. And the sources point out that it's not just about changing policies, it's about a shift in how we talk about immigration and the attitudes people have.
You're absolutely right. The language being used to describe immigrants and immigration has gotten really dehumanizing and inflammatory. Words like invasion and criminal aliens, they're used to scare people and make these harsh measures seem justified.
Yeah, that's a dangerous trend, and it has real-world consequences. We've already seen more hate crimes and anti-immigrant sentiment in recent years. And the sources say that these policies could make those things even worse, creating a climate of division and distrust.
It's a valid concern. And we can't forget that the impact of these policies goes way beyond immigrants themselves. They affect families, communities, the whole social fabric of the country.
So it's not just about immigration. It's a human rights issue, an economic issue, a social issue. It really does touch everything.
Huh.
But what about the legal side of all this? I mean, some of these policies have to be challenged in court, right?
Absolutely. The ACLU, for example, has already said they'll fight a lot of these policies in court. They argue that they violate constitutional rights and due process protections. And some states have also said they'll challenge certain measures.
So it sounds like we're headed for a long and messy legal battle. But even beyond the legal stuff, there's the question of what the public thinks. How do Americans feel about these policies?
Public opinion on immigration is complicated. It's often split along party lines. But our sources do point to a growing awareness of how much immigrants contribute to the economy and society, and there's definitely concern about the human cost of these harsh measures.
So there is some pushback, some resistance to all this. But what can regular people do to make their voices heard and fight for immigration policies that are more humane and fair?
There are a lot of ways to get involved. People can contact their elected officials, support organizations that are working on immigration issues, volunteer their time, and talk to each other about these complex issues in a way that's informed and productive.
That's a good point. It's important to remember that we're not helpless in the face of all this. We can all do something to shape the conversation and push for change. But changing gears a bit, the sources also talk about how these policies could specifically affect certain groups, like people with temporary protected status, or TPS. Can you explain what that is and how it might be impacted?
Sure, TPS is basically a status that's given to people from countries that are considered unsafe because of armed conflicts, natural disasters, or other really serious situations. It lets them live and work in the United States legally for a certain amount of time and protects them from being deported.
So there are people who are here legally, contributing to society, who could suddenly be at risk of being deported.
That's exactly it. And the consequences could be devastating. Imagine having to leave your life, your family, and go back to a country that's still dangerous.
It just seems so cruel and short-sighted. And speaking of short-sighted, the sources also talk about how these policies could affect the healthcare system here in the U.S.
Yeah, the impact on healthcare is a really important point that often gets overlooked. Immigrants, whether they're documented or not, they make up a big part of the healthcare workforce, especially in areas like nursing, home health care, and taking care of the elderly. Mass deportations and losing TPS could lead to huge shortages of healthcare workers, which could affect people's access to care and make it more expensive.
It's like another example of how these policies could have all these unintended consequences that just ripple through the entire system. And talking about systems, the sources also mention that private companies are playing a bigger and bigger role in immigration enforcement, especially when it comes to running detention centers.
You're right. Using private prisons for immigration detention has been controversial for years. People are worried about a lack of oversight, cost-cutting measures that put people's safety and well-being at risk, and the possibility that these companies are more interested in making money than in finding alternatives to detention.
It just sounds like a recipe for disaster. Private companies profiting off of locking people up.
It's a really complicated ethical issue, and our sources emphasize how important it is to have more transparency and accountability when it comes to using private contractors. We need to make sure that basic standards of care are being met and that detention is only used as a last resort.
It's a reminder that we need to pay attention not just to the policies themselves, but to how they're actually being put into practice. And speaking of paying attention, the sources also mention how these policies could impact specific immigrant communities, like those from Latin America and the Caribbean.
You're right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Different immigrant groups are affected differently. For example, a lot of the changes being talked about, like expanding expedited removal and the Remain in Mexico policy, they mostly impact people coming in at the southern border. And that's mainly people from Mexico, Central America, and increasingly South America, too.
So we're not just talking about policies in the abstract, right? We're talking about real people, families whose lives could be completely turned upside down by these decisions.
Exactly. And the sources really paint a grim picture of what could happen to these communities. We're talking about more families being separated, economic hardship when the people who support their families are deported, and just this constant fear and anxiety that affects every part of their lives.
It's like this domino effect where one policy change sets off a whole chain of negative consequences.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just the direct impact of the policies, it's the ripple effects they create. Like, the sources mention that immigrant families are becoming more hesitant to get health care, even for their kids who were born in the U.S. They're afraid of being reported to immigration.
So kids' health could be at risk because of policies that are meant to deter their parents. That's just awful.
It's a serious concern, and it raises the question of how these policies undermine public health, especially in communities with lots of immigrants. The sources point out that if people are too scared to see a doctor, it can lead to outbreaks of diseases that could have been prevented, diagnoses that come too late, and in the end, worse health for everyone.
So these policies aren't good for anyone. But what can we do? Is there any hope for a more humane and sensible approach to immigration?
There are some hopeful signs. The sources talk about how more and more states and cities are coming up with their own policies to protect immigrant rights. They're pushing back against some of the harsher federal measures. And there are advocacy groups and legal organizations that are challenging these policies in court and raising awareness about how they're affecting people.
So the fight's not over. There's still time to push back, to demand better from our leaders, and to create a society that's more just and welcoming for everyone.
I completely agree. And one of the most important things we can do is stay informed, educate ourselves about these issues, and have real, thoughtful conversations about the kind of society we want.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've looked at the potential impact of Trump's immigration policies from every angle: legal, economic, social, humanitarian, and it's clear that the stakes are incredibly high. But if there's one thing I've taken away from this conversation, it's that we can't just sit back and do nothing. We have to stay involved, stay informed, and stay committed to the values of justice and compassion that this country is supposed to be all about.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about immigration, we're really talking about who we are as a nation, what we value, and how we treat people who are different from us.
That's a great point.
Right.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you'll keep learning about these issues and use your voice to fight for a more just and humane immigration system.